Atamarie, no mai haere mai ki tēnei hui, ko Andrew Robertson toko ingoa. Good morning and welcome to this meeting. I'm Andrew. I am Consulting Director at Varian. I joined the team here about 7 months ago after spending around 8 years at Inland Revenue, where I led the Customer Insight and Evaluation Group for almost 4 years before moving into operational leadership roles. I've worked at a couple of other places in my time, but before I moved into the public sector, I spent nearly a decade working with the team here when we were Comma Brunton. And I actually presented the findings of the very first public sector reputation index back in 2016 at our launch event in Wellington at the Whare Function Centre. And now it's almost a decade later, and I think it's fair to say that our understanding, the team's understanding of public sector reputation has evolved considerably over this time, and I'm really looking forward to sharing some fresh insights with you today. I'll speak for about 30 minutes and then we'll move into a Q&A session. I have our co-managing director, Michael Dunn, also in the background, so if you do want to ask questions during the webinar, feel free to, and he might be able to answer some of those, and he will probably leave me some for the end as well. We are making this report available on our website during this webinar. So if there is a slide that maybe I might move through too quickly, or if you want to see more detail, then that will be available for you to look at. All right, so see if I can get this working. All right, I'll start just by quickly covering off what we mean when we talk about reputation and why it's important. So you can think of reputation as the overall impression people have about your agency based on what they think, feel, and believe. And I think one of the important things to keep in mind here is that reputation is not just based on visibility and what people know, it's based on how they feel and what they assume. It's shaped by direct experiences like service delivery, indirect signals such as media coverage or political commentary, and public narratives. So this agency is fair, or they're political or apolitical, or they're experts, or they don't listen. I see at least three reasons why reputation matters. It matters because trusted agencies are able to operate more efficiently and effectively. So when people trust an agency, they're more likely to follow its advice, use its services, and meet their obligations. So whether it's, I guess, getting vaccinated or submitting your tax return on time, installing smoke alarms, or evacuating in an emergency, higher trust helps an agency achieve what they need to do and ultimately reduces compliance costs to government, to New Zealand people and New Zealand businesses. Secondly, reputation matters because a respected agency is spoken highly of. This is something that we've seen clearly in our data each year. The survey shows that if your agency is in the high range, people are 6.5 times more likely to be advocates than critics. And this contributes to a wider sense that government is competent, fair, and working in the public interest. And finally, agencies with strong reputations are more resilient when things go wrong. So this chart, and just bear with me here, this chart shows the average change in reputation score since 2024 for any agency that has seen a net increase in media coverage. So I'll just say that again because it's a bit of a mouthful. Shows the average change in reputation score since 2024 for any agency that has seen an increase in essentially an increase in negative media coverage. Reputation scores for agencies in the low reputation range decreased by an average of 4 points since last year, whereas scores for agencies in the medium or high range actually increased by 1 point on average. So a good reputation essentially gives you the benefit of the doubt and helps maintain support when addressing issues or concerns. I'm just going to cover off just a few key points about how we measure reputation. I don't normally like to spend too much on methodology, but I think it's important, particularly for folk who may be joining us for the first time. This is the 9th year we've carried out the survey, which was benchmarked back in 2016. There are now 57 agencies included in the PSRI. Fieldwork was undertaken throughout April this year, and we interviewed just over 3,500 people. We draw the sample from online panels and we weight it to be representative of New Zealand by age, gender, region, ethnic identification, income, and household size. We assess reputation by asking New Zealanders, whether they agree or disagree with 16 attribute statements, which are grouped under 4 pillars: trust, leadership, social responsibility, and fairness. And each year we determine the relative importance of each pillar, essentially telling us what matters most to New Zealanders, and we use this to calculate each agency's reputation score. Excuse me while I just grab a drink of water. Before delving into this year's results, it's useful to consider the present context for the public sector and for New Zealand. And I think it's fair to say that over the last 12 months, New Zealand's public sector has faced some of its most significant challenges in recent memory. A wide range of issues have shaped public discourse and point to this being a year of disruption and debate. There are some issues, these are some issues that we could think of that may influence what's important to New Zealanders right now and contributed to the views of the public sector. Under sort of political and policy issues, of course, we've got public sector job cuts, budget reductions, spending constraints, restructuring, and back to work, back to office policies, return of 3 strikes, fast track approvals, transport and safety reforms. We've had instances of public servants being framed as woke or overly aligned with progressive values and not politically neutral. Under economic issues, we've seen rising cost of living despite inflation easing, media stories about struggling families, debates about income tax reductions versus public service funding trade-offs, pay equity disputes. And the social and cultural issues, of course, we've had significant public debate around the Treaty's Principles Bill, removal of co-governance provisions for water and environmental reforms, proposed curriculum changes de-emphasising New Zealand history and Te Ao Māori values, debate over are we one people versus a bicultural nation, media sector job cuts, including closure of Māori and Pacific news programming, and under environmental and resilience issues, we've got continued recovery from Cyclone Gabrielle, rollback of Resource Management Act reforms, the possibility of opening conservation land up to mining, and withdrawal from emissions reductions commitments. I think it's fair to say that there are some instances where either agencies or public servants may have been required to implement policies that they don't personally believe in. So I guess the big question is, what does this mean for how New Zealanders think about the public sector? So first turning to the overall public sector results. This is the overall public sector wide results. And at the overall public sector level, the average score across all agencies actually remains steady at 64, and this maintains the bounce back from that post-pandemic sort of loss of trust we saw in 2022 and 2023. But actually, when we look a bit deeper, it looks like reputation appears a little more fragile. So what you're looking at here is the distribution of scores this year and last year, and there's been a lot of movement among agencies with scores now more sort of tightly clustered. And I think this could have a few different implications. Firstly, while the overall public sector average may appear stable, this masks some big shifts for individual agencies. But another thought that I had is that as reputation scores become more tightly clustered, this might mean that public views are a little bit less agency specific and maybe more shaped by broader narratives such as perception of the public sector as a whole or views about the role of government in a time of constraint. Which leads me into another really interesting finding. I mentioned earlier that before calculating each agency's reputation score, we determine the importance of each pillar to New Zealanders. And this year, trust has emerged as the most dominant driver of reputation, perhaps driven by the growing emphasis on fiscal responsibility and competent service delivery, whereas social responsibility, which increased in importance during COVID, has emerged as being relatively less important. Now, attributes under that social responsibility pillar include as a positive influence on society and has a positive impact on people's mental and physical well-being, while attributes under that trust pillar include things like listens to the public's point of view, uses taxpayer money responsibly, is trustworthy, and can be relied upon to protect individuals' personal information. When we look at the average agreement across the attributes under each pillar, we see that trust in the public sector has risen by an additional 3 points this year, whereas agreement across the other pillars has risen only slightly or not at all. In fact, if we dive into changes in the individual significant changes with agreement in for the individual attributes this year, we can see that users taxpayer money responsibly has seen a significant increase. Increases are also seen in attributes relating to forward-looking leadership, engagement with Māori and Pacific peoples. But fewer New Zealanders agree that agencies deal fairly with people regardless of their background or role, which is perhaps a warning light for perceptions of equity and cohesion. So I'm sure this is what you've all been waiting for, and do forgive me for a second if I sound like I'm calling a bit of a horse race. But here are the top 10 agencies. Fire and Emergency New Zealand retains its position as the agency with the highest reputation score, but we've seen several changes within the rest of the top 10. Department of Conservation is second, up from rank 6 in 2024. GNS is third, up from 7th place. New Zealand Customs retains 4th place. Met Services in 5th place, up from 10th. NEMA is in 6th, down 1, and actually sounds a bit like a weather forecast. And places 7 to 10 have all risen from outside the top 10, including the New Zealand Defence Force, Aviation Security, Civil Aviation Authority, and NIWA. I think the common threads here are visibility, safety and protection, service during a crisis. But I also think Department of Conservation and New Zealand Defence Force point to a sense of maybe national purpose or pride being important to reputation. So I'm just going to show this briefly because I'm going to come back to it a bit later. This is showing the top 5 agencies under each pillar. You can see the top 5 agencies overall also appear in the top 5 across at least 3 of the 4 pillars. I'll come back to this in a sec. Given the context for the public sector this year that I covered earlier, we wanted to look at perceptions of political neutrality. So we included a new attribute in the questionnaire when we asked New Zealanders the extent to which they agree or disagree that each agency advises on or implements government policies to the best of its ability, regardless of which party is in government, so i.e. is politically neutral. And this slide displays agreement and disagreement with that statement for all 57 agencies. And I must say, having worked inside the public sector and experienced firsthand the emphasis placed on being politically neutral, this result initially came as some surprise to me. There are 22 agencies that are viewed as not being politically neutral by at least a quarter of New Zealanders. So I think this does point to a need for some agencies to build confidence in their neutrality. But we wanted to explore this a little further. So we looked at which segments within New Zealand tend to view government agencies in this way. And overall, we found this perception was particularly strong amongst groups that may feel less heard, less represented, or less well served. So ethnic minority groups or younger people are perhaps more skeptical of political neutrality. Home ownership and longer settlement ties are associated with higher confidence in public sector neutrality. And interestingly, those not in paid employment were more likely to view the public sector as politically neutral. I was thinking about that, it may be that they have more direct contact with public services, so trust in their operational neutrality despite potential policy disagreements. So which agencies are seen as more neutral, and what might that tell us? And I think this slide actually provides a few insights about how New Zealanders actually view political neutrality. It might not be exactly the same as how the Public Service Commission might define it. It appears linked to perceived independence. So agencies with a technical mandate or those that operate at arm's length from political decision making are more likely to be seen as impartial. When the public sees an agency's role is focused on delivering practical expert services rather than sort of shaping and implementing party-driven policy, they're more inclined to trust its neutrality. And finally, crisis and safety roles may enhance neutrality perceptions. So agencies like NEMA often emerge during emergencies, and their public good mandate and visibility during a crisis may boost perceptions of serving all New Zealanders equally. So then we examined how perceptions of public neutrality relate to reputation. And the results resonate with those earlier insights, actually. We calculated the amount of variability in each agency's reputation score for the number of years they've been in the PSRI, and we plotted that on the vertical axis there. So agencies with more stable reputation scores are towards the top, and agencies with more volatile reputation scores are towards the bottom. And then we plotted perceptions of agencies' political neutrality along the horizontal axis. And what we see here is that the agencies seen as apolitical tend to experience less volatility in how the public perceives them over time. So this suggests that perhaps a reputation for independence and impartiality may act as a kind of a buffer, helping agencies maintain public confidence when political or media environments shift around. Whereas agencies more entangled in political debate may find their reputations more reactive to external events. So a reputation built on neutrality may not spike as dramatically, but it might not crash as dramatically either. So I guess the big question is, how can an agency improve its reputation, and what better place to look than agencies that have improved since 2024? So we've seen 6 agencies that have shown the strong improvement since last year, and they are Oranga Tamariki, Classification Office, Te Kawa Mataho, New Zealand On Air, Broadcasting Standards Authority, and the Ministry of Education. Now, to understand sources of influence, each year we ask New Zealanders which, if any, of the following sources have impacted their views of each agency. Now, on the surface, media and comms appear to have the most influence on reputation, especially the news media. But, sorry, let's move the slide along. But most agencies that have improved their reputation relied on a combination of visibility and service delivery. So this chart shows the relative influence of media versus experience for every agency that improved their reputation scores since 2024. And what we see is that very few agencies managed to do so through media or service delivery alone. So it's not just about sort of getting positive messages out through the media. This is an analysis that we've run a few times now, and I've always found it valuable when I was working within the public sector, as it helped me convey the different levers that my agency had for improving reputation and trust, and it's not the same for all agencies. So over on the left here, we can see that public-facing agencies have a greater ability to improve their reputation through delivery. But what I think is really interesting is actually the large group of agencies whose reputation scores are based on general impressions or how people feel. And we wanted to delve a little more into impressions this year to better understand the emotional connections people have with public sector organisations. I guess the behavioural scientist in me knows that as human beings, we often base our decisions and actions on our emotions and how we feel. And I'm sure you'll agree, most New Zealanders don't sort of sit around thinking about the public sector, carefully weighing up the pros and cons of different agencies. So I've often wondered to what extent the emotional connection influences public sector reputation. And just coming back to our top 5 agencies, we consistently see agencies near the top that are sometimes rated quite highly on attributes that we wouldn't necessarily associate with them. So, for example, Fire and Emergency New Zealand being relied upon to protect people's information or behaving in a responsible way towards the environment. So this year, we measured emotional connection by asking New Zealanders to tell us how they feel about each agency as quickly as possible on a scale ranging from extremely positive to extremely negative. And we wanted people to do that as quickly as possible to avoid overthinking and really get at the emotional side. So on balance, New Zealanders feel more positive than negative towards agencies, but as my teenage sons might say, most agencies are pretty mid. There is a relatively small group of agencies that do evoke, an unequivocal positive response from New Zealanders, but it's not a simple case of high emotion equals high reputation score. So New Zealand Police are one of the agencies that evokes the strongest positive emotion, but they haven't featured amongst the top 10 this year. Agencies that tend to evoke strong positive emotions, they protect people like Fire and Emergency New Zealand and police. They protect places like Department of Conservation, maybe are a source of national pride, New Zealand Defence Force, or they show up in people's lives in the moments that matter. But overall, you could say that New Zealanders feel rather ambivalent towards the public sector, not disliked, but I guess distant, and you could maybe interpret that ambivalence as a quiet warning that New Zealand is saying, you don't kind of feel that relevant to me. So this slide shows that, again, while there are some agencies that evoke strong positive and negative emotions, ambivalence is definitely the more common response. And this is perhaps an opportunity in disguise. So it points to an opportunity to strengthen connections with New Zealanders by being more visible in people's lives, sharing human stories and values, demonstrating relevance and care. Interestingly, there is a small group of agencies that appear to be rather polarizing, and I've shaded them slightly darker there. So they evoke both strong negative and strong positive reactions. Just take a mental note of that, as I'm going to come back to it in just a short moment. Now, given the public sector spending constraints over the last year, we were keen to explore public sector funding once more. And we've asked this question over the last 4 years. We see that over time, I essentially see two things here. We see that over time, more New Zealanders actually hold an opinion about public sector funding, perhaps not too surprising given the recent public debate or the recent actions. But we also see that most don't want to see it further reduced. Nearly a third would like to see it increased. Those more supportive of a funding increase include older New Zealanders, those not employed, those living with a disability, and Wellington residents who, as you know, have been disproportionately affected by public sector spending cuts. But I think it's really interesting when we cross support for funding by reputation score, we can see that there are, I guess, three main types of funding reputation archetypes. There's those agencies that are believed in and people believe they should be better funded. Those that are believed in, but New Zealanders believe the current funding seems sufficient. And those that are seen as underfunded and underperforming. And those more polarizing agencies that we saw earlier tend to show up in this group, evoking both frustration and sympathy from New Zealanders. These agencies are seen as important, but New Zealanders, I think, experience firsthand the strain they're under, needing to deliver their function at minimal costs. So I'm going to finish off by summarizing what I think are 4 opportunities that I see for agencies to improve their reputation. Based on the data I'm showing today, there are other opportunities as well, but this is what I've seen from the analysis that we've undertaken. Firstly, focus on service delivery and demonstrating political neutrality. So in a highly politicized environment, reputation is strong where politics appears absent. Agencies perceived as independent and expert-led have higher reputation scores and are rated more politically neutral. And these agencies also show more stable reputation scores over time. So where possible for your agency, where can you make technical, operational, or customer-centric narratives more visible? Build emotional connection by becoming more visible and human. So we've seen that agencies that stir positive emotions are those that show up in people's lives in tangible, relatable ways. Ambivalence is the dominant emotional response, but also an opportunity. Visibility during crisis or a sense of national or local identity build connection. So there may be opportunities for your agency to share stories of service, frontline impact, and human value. Thirdly, strengthen reputation through action, not just impression. So the agencies that improved the most did so through consistent delivery, not media alone. Communication helps, absolutely, but experience and frontline interaction can build understanding and trust. Agencies seen as distant or vague rely more on gut feel, which can swing quickly in either direction. So where you can, invest in everyday visible credibility. And finally, understand your funding support position and act accordingly. So public views on funding are influenced by reputation. Agencies seen as deserving, underfunded, and strained receive sympathy and advocacy. So know what quadrant you're in and tailor messaging to reinforce trust or demonstrate value. Making your resource needs visible, I guess, without sounding defensive, can enhance advocacy. And so I think that brings me to the end of my speaking slides today, but I'm happy to take any questions. I'll just see if I can bring up the Q&A.